In this video, I'm going to talk about romance and sexuality, or begin to talk about sexuality in adolescence. And one thing I know from teaching this is sometimes people will have very strong opinions going in, like, oh, this is a bad thing. This is a bad thing, and it should not happen. Teens should not date, and they definitely shouldn't be having sex. And remember, go way back when we were talking about the beginning of the class. One of the things we have to do, since this is a science class, psychology is a science, I present to you research, I present to you things that we have learned by actually observing real human beings, that we have to take our feelings and our agenda and our beliefs and try to put them to the side and just talk about, well, let's talk about what do we know? What are common typical behaviors, what have been linked to behaviors and trends. And so we're going to focus on research, but I do remember from teaching in person that I'll often have students who they clearly have a strong negative reaction, like, okay, so how do we stop teens from wanting to do this? And I will tell you right now that research so far has found nothing at all that would make teens not be interested in dating and sexuality. So let's start by talking about having romantic relationships, romantic partnerships. There's a lot of diversity in terms of if someone is dating in adolescence, when they start. I often have students, they'll have stories like, oh, I remember, I had friends in elementary school. They were dating in the 4th grade. And I mean, you will hear stories like that. I don't know how, serious or intensely emotional those relationships were, but they are rare. Most people will start their dating later, like adolescence. And so the research still, at the time of recording, most recent research still has romantic partnerships typically first occurring in high school. You're going to know examples. You're going to know people who started dating earlier, but it's more typical to have those first relationships in high school, and for some people later, and so for some people never. One thing I have not addressed in this particular class yet is some individuals identify as asexual or aromantic. That's actually the A in LGBTQIA+. Sometimes people think the A stands for ally. It actually stands for asexual, or aromantic. And so some individuals, they're not interested. And they are a complex, diverse group of individuals. Sometimes they still want to date, but they're not interested in sexuality. There's not just one way to fit that category, to fit that label. And so let's not engage in the ace erasure. And so some people, they're never going to be interested in this thing. All right. So high school, typical, average starting point. And one thing we know about dating or having romantic relationships in adolescence is there's a lot of fluidity. There's not a lot of commitment in long-term relationships, although a lot of times students will have that one example. They're like, oh, we had these friends, they started dating in like 7th grade and they stayed together and now they're married. Those stories exist, but they're not typical. They're not normative. And so there's a lot of fluidity, trying, dating different people. Remember, you're figuring out your identity. Sometimes that's figuring out what kind of partner you're interested in. And so you don't have a lot of permanency. You have rapid fire relationships, dating a lot of people, or interested, having crushes on different people. And so, permanency is not, permanency and commitment are not your usual trend that you see with adolescent romantic relationships. Now, in terms of having healthy romantic relationships, or whether or not the relationship involves sexual behavior or not, and it is very important to acknowledge and explain that when I say sexual behavior, I don't necessarily mean penetrative vaginal intercourse. PNV intercourse. A lot of times people's mind kind of thinks of that's the only thing that counts as sex. There are lots of behaviors that make the body feel good and that two people can do together that play upon their sexual impulses, and they feel good, and they are used for expressing affection or just having fun. All right, and they don't necessarily have to involve sexual intercourse. You have other types of sexual activity. I remember I went to one conference one time, and a researcher defined kissing as sexual activity, and I actually thought that was refreshing. I like that, to acknowledge that, yeah, this it's not going to make you pregnant. A lot of people focus on activities that can make you pregnant, but it is still sexual activity. It's still, if you're with a partner that you actually like in that way, it's going to feel good in that way, and it fits into that category and serving those functions. And anytime there is a study that talks about sexual activity, they're going to be very clear about how they measured it, what counts. So it's not always just the one thing that everybody always wants to count. And we're going to get to it. But we often like to forget that, some people have same-sex relationships. Oh, yeah. All right, so peers influence romantic and sexual relationships, or whether there's a sexual aspect of romantic relationships. In the ways that we've talked about previously when we talked about peers, your peers' standards and beliefs and perceived activities will influence what you think are expected of you or normal for you. And so if you have a lot of friends where they're either sexually active, or you think they are sexually active, they're saying they're sexually active, because those two things don't always map onto each other perfectly, you are often going to find sexual behavior, particular types of sexual behavior, as more acceptable. Whereas if you have friends who are very big on abstinence, and they talk about abstinence, you may feel more ashamed of sexual desires or any sexual behaviors you've engaged in, because your peers are presenting a different standard. So peers definitely influence attitudes towards relationships and sexuality. Now, speaking of sexual activity, actually, my writing's real small. I got to get the glasses real close to my face here. Okay, so sexual intercourse. Focusing on the act that often gets focused on when we talk about sexual activity in adolescence, because let's face it, it's the one we worry about, because it could lead to pregnancy. If you ask people, all right, so when are people doing that? Depending on your own experiences and your peers' perceived experiences, you'll have different ideas of when it's normal to have sexual intercourse. Some people will use the term lose your virginity, but a lot of people have pointed out that there are problematic there are problems with using that term. Virginity kind of implies like a purity, and like you lose it, it's like it frames it as a negative act, and it's often very focused on the one act. And so a lot of times we just like to be specific, like, okay, well, let's talk about, have people had sexual intercourse? Penis and vagina, penetration, sexual intercourse is what we are talking about, to give you the full operational definition. All right, so if you talk to high schoolers, have high schoolers had sexual intercourse? Well, in the beginning, your freshmen, your ninth graders, some have, but not everyone. And I wish my print is very small here. Trying to get up and big here. Actually, hold on one second here. All right, I had to get the magnifying glass out so I can see my small print. All right, because I wanted to make sure I didn't falsely remember the numbers. All right, so in ninth grade. In ninth grade, based on one study, a large study, in ninth grade, it was about 20% who had already had sexual intercourse. That's relevant to when we start sex ed. It's like, hey, let's wait until it's relevant, and then you start the sex ed with, say, ninth graders, and then some of them are like, well, we already did a lot of this. All right, now, so let's go to senior year or 12th grade, and I am basing this on the U.S. educational system. If you're watching the video and you're not from the U.S., it's just your final year of high school. It's the majority. It's over 50%. Over 50% have had sexual intercourse by the time you're interviewing 12th graders. All right, now it's not like everybody has. All right, many people will have stories, they're like, oh yeah, me or my friend, we had not done that yet when we were in 12th grade. But the majority, over 50% have. So it's one of these things that a lot of people consider talking about sex in adolescence is sort of a taboo topic. But the thing is, it's happening. All right, for a lot of adolescents, they're engaging in this behavior. So we definitely need to do research to understand the behavior, because you can't pretend like it's not happening just because you'd rather it wasn't happening. Now, another term that's relevant, catching up with modern times. Some people will also engage in something called sexting, and I know many of you know what it is. Let's go. That is when you are sending explicit messages, like sending nudes or verbal messages with sexual content with cell phones. All right, through. And sometimes we're extending it to sending through apps and messaging, but typically sending it through texting with the cell phone, sending pictures, imagery, words that are sexual in nature. All right, a lot of parents and teachers are alarmed at the trend of sexting in adolescents, in middle schoolers and high schoolers. The norms about sexting will vary from group to group. Some groups will be very shameful about it, like, oh, you could not do that. And others are like, oh, everybody's doing it. And then so someone might be like, well, everybody's doing this. If I don't do it, I look like the big prude, the big weirdo. And my slang is going to be out of date because I'm a Gen Xer. What insert current slang here for what you would call someone who's like not appropriately into sex or sexuality. And so what do we know about sexting? All right, so the research, it's a newer phenomenon, so we have less research than we have for other topics. But what do we know so far? Sexting is correlated. It is correlated with increased sexual experience. So you're sexting, you're more likely to actually be engaged in sexual experiences. More oral sex, 7 times more likely to have participated in oral sex when you have sexted. And sex, this is alarming, sex without a condom, unprotected sex, sex that leaves the potential for pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections. Unprotected sex is 5 times more likely in those who have sexted. All right, so reason for concern potentially. Another reason for concern about sexting. You often send these without realizing that they can get out there. Anything that's sent electronically, there's a record. You can save that. So even if you're really into your partner, whoever you're sending the explicit content to, you don't know that person. They might change. They might get angry at you. Adolescents do impulsive things. They don't always think straight. And it increases the chance of there being revenge porn. I'm pretty sure we probably are familiar with that term, but that's when, to get back at you, somebody will send out your explicit material. If you sent nudes, they hold on to them, and then when they're mad at you to get back at you, they can send those nudes out so everybody can see your personal content that was meant just for them. Revenge porn can be part of cyberbullying and can be very upsetting for the individual that's the target. And legally, there are issues with does it count as a crime in a particular area? But even beyond legal issues, it is a very upsetting experience for the person who experience, not just embarrassment, but the invasion of privacy. Now, another problematic issue with sexting is if you talk to adolescents about their views of sexting, many do not consider it pornography. They consider it like in a separate category, and many consider it quite normal and expected these days, depending on their group norms and such. And so there's sort of a perception thing. Like what a lot of adults consider is, oh my gosh, who would do that? A lot of adolescents are like, yeah, everybody's doing that. It's no big deal. It's not like it's porn, right? So perhaps need for education about sexting, but that would be included in sex education, which a lot of areas are like, if you educate about sex, people will have sex, even though research shows they do anyway. We're getting to that in a bit. All right, and so trying to figure out if I should say one more thing or put it in the next video. I think I'm going to put it in the next video. Yeah, we're going to talk about same-sex adolescent relationships in their own separate video, because I know myself. I know I'm probably going to want to add extra research and findings and issues about that one.